I never thought I'd find myself standing outside a hotel room, my heart hammering in my chest as muffled laughter slipped through the door. But there I was. After 3.5 years of marriage, the woman I trusted more than anyone was on the other side of that door. And she wasn't alone. I didn't knock. I didn't barge in. I didn't need to. The truth was already clear, and I refused to give her the satisfaction of a dramatic scene. Instead, I made a choice, one that would change everything. I turned around, walked away, and started packing up my life, leaving behind not just her, but the betrayal that had shattered everything we'd built. But before we get deeper into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you like stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Lisa slammed her coffee cup onto the table, the sharp clatter of porcelain against wood cutting through the thick silence. She had rehearsed this moment over and over, playing out every possible reaction Ethan might have. But this cold, detached stare? It was unbearable. Damn it, Ethan, don't you care? Her voice wavered, frustration bubbling over like a dam ready to burst. Ethan didn't even blink. He leaned back in his chair, folding the newspaper with the kind of slow, deliberate movements that made her skin crawl. His calmness was worse than any shouting match, more humiliating than any accusation. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, almost casual, like he was talking about the weather instead of their collapsing marriage. I stopped caring when you stopped being a wife. The words hit harder than Lisa expected. Her lips parted, ready with a sharp retort, but nothing came out. A lump in her throat held the words hostage. His gaze stayed locked on hers, steady, unshaken, like he'd been waiting for years to say exactly that. Shut up. What the hell is that supposed to mean? She demanded, trying to bury her fear beneath her anger. Ethan leaned in, resting his elbows on the table. And for the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was something far worse, resignation. It means, he said, his voice slow, deliberate, that I've spent the last year watching you lie straight to my face. Watching you act like a wife while sneaking off with someone else. And you know what, Lisa? I don't even care anymore. He let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. So, congratulations. You win. Now get out. Lisa's breath hitched. This wasn't the Ethan she knew, the one who avoided conflict, who always smoothed things over, who worked too hard to keep the peace. No, the man sitting in front of her now was a stranger, and the realization sent an uneasy chill down her spine. You think you're so damn righteous, she spat, her voice trembling. Like you had nothing to do with this? You're not perfect either, Ethan. Don't act like you didn't play a part. But he didn't take the bait. He didn't argue. He didn't lash out. He just stood up, his movements slow and precise, like every step had been planned long before this moment. Maybe I did, he admitted, walking toward the door. But the difference is, I never pretended to be someone I wasn't. He paused, hand on the handle, and turned to look at her one last time. Have a nice life, Lisa. And then he was gone, leaving Lisa standing in the wreckage of her own making, watching the cracks spread through the carefully crafted world she had tried so hard to maintain. As the door clicked shut behind him, Ethan took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. His heartbeat was steady, his mind already working through the next steps. This wasn't some impulsive decision. He'd been preparing for this moment for months, and now, it was time to set everything into motion. First, he grabbed his laptop from the office. The stillness of the early morning was broken only by the quiet tapping of keys as he logged into their shared bank accounts. His face remained unreadable as he methodically moved funds from their joint savings into his personal account. He didn't drain it, he left just enough to keep it open, but not enough for Lisa to wreak financial havoc on her way out. Then, he turned to the credit cards. With the same level of precision, he cancelled every shared account, making sure she couldn't rack up any more debt in his name. He made a mental note to check the statements in the coming weeks, just in case she tried anything before the changes were finalized. This wasn't revenge. It was self-preservation. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was finally in control. Without missing a beat, Ethan moved on to his investments. He offloaded a handful of underperforming stocks he had flagged earlier, streamlining his financial situation even further. As the transactions processed, he leaned back in his chair, feeling a brief, unexpected wave of relief. This wasn't about revenge, it was survival. But why now? The question crept into his mind uninvited as he scanned the confirmation emails stacking up in his inbox. He had put up with Lisa's indifference for years, the lies, the widening gap between them, the way she'd become a stranger in their own home. He had told himself things would improve, that it was just a rough patch. He had made excuse after excuse, convincing himself that the woman he married was still in there somewhere. But the truth? The truth had hit him like a freight train the day he saw those photos. Marcus's smug face. Lisa's unmistakable smile, the one she hadn't shown him in years. A smile meant for someone else. That's when it all became clear. He hadn't been holding on out of love. He had been clinging to the illusion that their years together meant something, desperate to prove he hadn't wasted a decade of his life. Letting go had seemed impossible. But now that the moment had arrived, he was surprised by how freeing it felt. Ethan shut his laptop and reached for his phone. A quick call to his lawyer, Jason, confirmed the next steps. The divorce papers would be filed before the week was out. Jason had been ready for months, and with the evidence Ethan had provided, there wasn't much left to argue. Judges in their state didn't look kindly on infidelity, especially when financial deceit was thrown into the mix. As he ended the call, Ethan let his gaze drift out the window, past the neatly trimmed lawn he'd spent years maintaining. The house, the routine, the life, they all felt hollow now, like a carefully staged scene for a play he no longer wanted a role in. But that was okay. He had rebuilt before. He could do it again. With a renewed sense of control, he logged out of every shared streaming account, changed the Wi-Fi password, and revoked Lisa's access to the grocery delivery service. Petty? Maybe. But it was symbolic, his way of reclaiming every inch of his life, down to the smallest details. By the time Lisa walked back into the living room that evening, the world she had taken for granted had been wiped clean of Ethan entirely. It had all started with a feeling he couldn't shake. The late nights. The way Lisa's eyes seemed to cloud over when she looked at him, like she wasn't really there anymore. At first, it had been subtle, easy to ignore. But with each passing week, that gut instinct only grew louder. Instead of confronting her outright, he'd chosen a different path. He needed proof. Not assumptions. Not gut feelings. Proof. The memory was still sharp in his mind. A dimly lit office, the kind of place where people came when they were ready to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Ethan sat rigid in the chair across from the private investigator, a wiry man with keen eyes and a voice that carried no trace of sympathy. The faint scent of stale coffee clung to the air as the investigator slid a folder across the desk. "She's been meeting him at motels for months," the man said flatly. "Different places, same guy. Marcus. Here's your proof." Ethan hesitated before opening the folder. He wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, a mistake, something he could explain away. But as soon as his eyes landed on the photographs, the denial shattered. Lisa, walking beside Marcus, her hand tucked into his arm. Lisa, laughing, caught mid-motion, a happiness on her face Ethan hadn't seen in years. Lisa, stepping into a motel room with him, the door closing behind them. Each image was a punch to the gut, but Ethan kept his expression unreadable. He wouldn't give in to the anger, wouldn't let it take control. I didn't want to believe it, he said, his voice measured, though it took effort to keep it that way. They never do, the investigator replied, leaning back in his chair. But let's be honest, people don't hire me unless they already know. I just confirm it for them. Ethan swallowed hard, then exhaled, pushing past the last remnants of denial. He folded the folder shut, slid it into his briefcase, and gave a small nod. That's all I need. The investigator studied him for a moment, then raised an eyebrow. Most guys lose their minds when they see this. They blow up, confront her, throw her out the same night. You're really gonna just sit on this? Ethan let out a slow, controlled breath and allowed himself a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. No, he said quietly. I'm going to wait. Timing is everything. The investigator simply shrugged, his expression indifferent. He'd seen this story play out 100 times before. Your call, he said, voice flat. Just don't let it eat away at you too long. Secrets like this have a way of festering. Ethan left the office without another word, the folder tucked securely under his arm. As he stepped outside, the weight of what he had just confirmed pressed against his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to go straight to Lisa, to demand an explanation, to force her to look him in the eye and admit what she had done. But he knew better. Blowing up would only give her an advantage, an opportunity to twist things in her favor. If he wanted to come out of this with his dignity, and his finances, intact, he had to play it smart. He needed a plan. So, over the next few weeks, Ethan put on an act. He played the role of the unsuspecting husband, keeping his voice even, his routine unchanged. He still greeted Lisa the same way, still made small talk, still went through the motions of a marriage that, in reality, had already crumbled. He even arranged a couple of date nights, just to keep up the illusion. It wasn't easy. Every forced smile, every half-hearted excuse she gave, chipped away at him. But he held firm, because patience wasn't just a tool, it was power. The longer he waited, the more control he reclaimed. And when the time finally came to confront her, he would be ready. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching as the sun melted into the horizon. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but his face gave nothing away. He had spent years swallowing his emotions, pushing them down until they barely registered. Now, it was second nature. The sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway pulled him from his thoughts. Turning his head, he saw Emily approaching, arms wrapped around herself against the cool night air. Emily had always been a steady presence in his life, his neighbor, his friend. She had a way of understanding him without needing words. But tonight, there was something different in her expression, a slight hesitation in her step, as if she could sense the storm brewing beneath his quiet exterior. Hey, she said softly, her voice careful. I saw Lisa leave earlier. Everything okay? Ethan exhaled, a dry, bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Let's just say she made her choice, and I made mine. Emily nodded, stepping closer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, filled with things left unsaid. Then, finally, Emily spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. You deserve better, Ethan. Someone who actually sees you. Her words caught him off guard. He turned his head slightly, and for the first time, really looked at her. There was something behind her gaze, something deeper than concern, something that had been there for a while but had gone unnoticed. Emily, he started, unsure of where this conversation was heading. But she just smiled, a small, knowing smile. You don't have to say anything, she murmured. Just don't let this break you, okay? And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan sitting there, his mind strangely quiet for the first time in a long time. For once, he felt like someone truly saw him. The next morning, Ethan walked into the living room to find Lisa pacing, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together. The tension in the air was thick, pressing against the walls, filling every inch of space between them. As soon as he stepped inside, she snapped her head toward him, her eyes burning with anger. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp and demanding. Ethan sighed, leaning casually against the doorway. "Go ahead. I'm listening." Lisa's jaw clenched. "I'm not leaving, Ethan. This house is half mine, whether you like it or not." A short, humorless laugh escaped him before he could stop it. "Half yours? Fine. Then you can take half the mortgage too. Sound fair?" Her face flushed red with fury. "Don't you dare twist this around on me. You think you can just cut me out of everything? The accounts? The credit cards? What are you trying to prove?" Ethan stepped forward, his calm, measured demeanor unsettling her more than any shouting match could have. "I'm not trying to prove anything, Lisa. I'm just done." His voice was firm, steady, final. "You want half the house? Fine. Then you can start paying for it, just like I have for the past 10 years. And while you're at it, you can cover the utilities, the maintenance, and all the repairs, too." Lisa's frustration boiled over, her voice rising with the force of her anger. "You're being petty. You can't just erase me like this." Ethan exhaled slowly, shaking his head as his voice dropped to an icy calm. "Petty?" He let out a bitter chuckle. "Petty would have been tossing your things onto the front lawn the second I found out about Marcus. But I didn't. I waited. I let you keep pretending this life was yours to destroy." His eyes hardened. "Not anymore." For the first time, Lisa hesitated. Her stance shifted, her shoulders tightening as she tried to regain control of the conversation. "You don't have the right to treat me like this. I've put just as much into this house as you have." Ethan crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "You're right. You did contribute something." He let the silence stretch, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "Lies. Deception. Infidelity." His gaze locked onto hers. "Tell me, Lisa, how much does that add to the property value?" Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She had no comeback, no clever twist to throw back at him. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of Ethan's measured breathing. Then, with a sharp turn, Lisa spun on her heel and stormed out of the room, muttering under her breath. Ethan watched her go, his face unreadable. He knew she wasn't done fighting, not yet. But one thing was clear. This was the beginning of the end. That evening, Ethan sat at the dining table, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the wood. Across from him, Lisa stood stiffly, arms crossed over her chest, her expression flickering between defiance and frustration. The air between them was charged, sharp enough to cut through. He leaned back slightly, watching her. "You really think this is just about Marcus, don't you?" Lisa narrowed her eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and unshaken. "I'm talking about the others. The ones before him." He tilted his head, studying her reaction. "You really think I never noticed, Lisa? That I've been blind all these years?" For just a second, something shifted in her expression, something small, but telling. Then, just as quickly, she masked it with indignation. "You're delusional," she snapped. "There were no other men. You're making up stories to justify your own cold behavior." Ethan let out a quiet, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I kept my mouth shut the first 3 times. Not anymore." Lisa stiffened as Ethan reached into a folder resting on the table and slid a small stack of photos across to her. She hesitated before picking them up, her fingers trembling slightly. Hotel lobbies. Lingering touches. stolen glances. Intimacy that couldn't be explained away. Different men, different places, the same story. Her breath hitched. This doesn't mean anything, she stammered, her voice rising, her grip tightening on the photos. You're twisting things. These could be anyone. Friends. Co-workers. Save it, Ethan cut her off, his voice as cold as the air between them. The first one? I told myself it was a mistake. Late business dinners. Cancelled plans. I gave you the benefit of the doubt. He leaned back, jaw tightening. The second? I convinced myself we were just in a rough patch. That we could fix it. But by the third. He let out a slow breath, his eyes never leaving hers. I realized you didn't want to fix anything. Lisa's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard. You never said anything. Ethan nodded slowly. Because I wanted to believe you were better than this, he said, his voice steady. But every time I forgave, you gave me another reason not to. He let the weight of his words settle before speaking again. Do you even know what it feels like to be invisible in your own marriage? To watch the person you love look you in the eye and lie to your face? To pretend like everything is fine while you're the only one trying? Tears welled in Lisa's eyes, but Ethan didn't flinch. You don't get to cry now, he said flatly. This isn't about your guilt. Or your excuses. This is about accountability. Her hands shook as she let the photos slip from her grasp, falling haphazardly onto the table. The fight drained from her posture, her shoulders slumping in quiet defeat. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered. Any of it. Ethan let out a breath, slow and steady, then stood, pushing his chair back. You didn't mean for it to happen? Ethan repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. That's your excuse? You didn't mean to betray me, again and again? You didn't mean to destroy our marriage? Lisa let out a quiet sob, her gaze fixed on the floor, unwilling or unable to meet his eyes. But Ethan was done. He exhaled, shaking his head as he turned away. His voice was firm, final. Intentions don't matter, Lisa. Actions do. And yours have consequences. The next evening, Ethan found himself back on the porch, the last light of the sun stretching long shadows across the yard. His mind was a mess of tangled thoughts, replaying every moment of his confrontation with Lisa. He had known this ending was inevitable, but knowing it and living through it were two very different things. Just as he was about to head inside, the soft crunch of gravel caught his attention. He glanced up to see Emily approaching, her steps careful, as if she were afraid of intruding. In her hands, she carried a small plate covered with a cloth. I thought you could use something warm, she said, her voice gentle but steady. She held the plate out, a tentative smile touching her lips. Ethan hesitated, then accepted it with a small nod, setting it down beside him. Thanks, Emily. You didn't have to do that. I know, she replied, settling onto the step beside him. For a while, they sat in silence. Not the awkward kind, just a quiet, understanding space between them. The kind of silence that didn't demand filling. Then, Emily took a deep breath, as if working up the courage to say something. Ethan, she murmured, her voice softer now, I've watched you carry this burden for so long. You've always been the strong one, keeping everything together, even when no one noticed. She turned to him then, her eyes full of something earnest, something unshakable. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. Ethan's brows pulled together slightly. Emily? She lifted a hand, stopping him gently. Let me finish. Her tone was calm, insistent, not demanding, just sure. You're worth fighting for, Ethan. Let me prove it. Her words settled between them, raw and open. For the first time, Ethan really looked at her. Not just saw her standing there, but saw her. There was no pity in her face, no judgment, no pressure. Just quiet certainty. She wasn't offering him sympathy. She was offering him hope. Emily. He started, then hesitated, his voice quieter than he expected. I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is. A small smile played at her lips as she nodded. I'm not asking for anything right now, she assured him. I just want you to know that when you are ready, I'll be here. No pressure. No expectations. Her honesty broke through something inside him, slipping past the walls he had spent years building. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something stir inside him, something unfamiliar. Something that felt a little like hope. He exhaled, the tightness in his chest loosening just a little. Thank you, he said simply. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The morning after Lisa's latest outburst, Ethan sat across from Jason in his lawyer's sleek, modern office. The low hum of the air conditioning filled the room as Jason flipped through the folder Ethan had handed him. With each page, his expression grew more serious. Finally, Jason leaned back, tapping a pen against his desk. You've got a strong case here, Ethan, he said matter-of-factly. With evidence of infidelity, financial misconduct, and now her recent behavior, this is all working in your favor. Ethan crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. I don't just want the divorce, Jason. I need to make sure she doesn't drag this out, or try to bleed me dry in the process. Jason gave a knowing smirk. Don't worry. We'll make sure she doesn't walk away with more than she deserves. I'll have the papers drafted and filed today. With what you've given me, this should move quickly. Ethan nodded, then leaned forward. His voice was firm, unwavering. And about the restraining order, I want to make sure she can't come back and do any more damage. Jason's expression sobered. We've got more than enough to justify filing for one. The footage of her trashing your property? That alone is solid evidence. Add in the threats and her erratic behavior? The court should have no problem granting it. Ethan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. It wasn't over yet, but at least now, things were moving in the right direction. Ethan felt a small sense of relief, though the weight of it all still pressed down on him. I just want this to be over, Jason. I'm done playing games. Jason gave a firm nod. And it will be over. But we're going to do it the right way. No loose ends. No room for her to flip the script on you. As Jason began laying out the next steps, Ethan listened carefully. The process was clear, the divorce papers would be served immediately, along with the request for a restraining order. If Lisa tried to fight it, the court would examine the evidence that was overwhelmingly in Ethan's favor. Jason's confidence was reassuring, but there was still a nagging unease deep in Ethan's gut. He knew Lisa well enough to know that, when cornered, she wouldn't go down quietly. By the time the meeting wrapped up, Ethan had signed every document necessary and left the office with a renewed sense of determination. Stepping outside, he inhaled deeply as a cool breeze hit his face. The noise of the busy streets surrounded him, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was reclaiming something, control. Not just over the situation, but over his own life. That afternoon, Jason called with an update. The papers have been served, and the restraining order is in motion. If she tries anything, Ethan, don't hesitate to call the police. You've got the law on your side now. Ethan thanked him, then hung up, staring out the window of his office. There was still a long road ahead, but at least now, he had a direction. He wasn't stumbling through the dark anymore. The pieces were falling into place, and Lisa's hold over his life was slipping away, inch by inch. It was a quiet afternoon when Ethan finally heard Marcus's side of the story. They sat across from each other in a small cafe, the air thick with tension, yet strangely civil. Marcus, clearly uneasy, stirred his coffee without drinking it, his expression troubled. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "She told me you were abusive," Marcus admitted, his fingers tightening around the cup. "That you controlled her. That she felt trapped, scared." He let out a slow breath. "And I believed her." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He let Marcus talk. "It started as little things she'd say in passing," Marcus continued, shaking his head. "Complaints about how cold you were, how you ignored her. Then it escalated, stories about fights, about you screaming at her, threatening her." He paused, guilt flashing across his face. "She had me convinced she was a victim, Ethan. That's why I never questioned anything when we started seeing each other." Marcus finally met Ethan's gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and frustration. "But now, looking back, I see it for what it was. She used me. Played on my sympathy to justify what she was doing." Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around his coffee cup. "I figured as much," he said, his voice even. "She's always known how to spin a story." Marcus swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he said. "For believing her. For being part of it." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not your fault she's a liar," he said. "But that doesn't excuse what either of you did." The weight of Marcus's confession hung between them, a stark reminder of just how deep Lisa's deception ran. The house was eerily silent when Ethan got home. Too silent. The kind of quiet that made his stomach tighten. Stepping inside, his eyes immediately caught the shattered vase in the entryway. Glass shards lay scattered across the floor like jagged confetti. His heart sank, but he didn't react. Instead, he moved carefully through the house, taking in the damage with a detached, methodical calm. The living room had taken the worst of it. Couch cushions had been slashed open, stuffing spilling out in uneven piles. Picture frames had been knocked over or smashed completely, their memories lost in a mess of broken glass. Lisa had been here. And she had made sure he felt it at I in the kitchen, cabinet doors hung open, their contents scattered across the floor. Pots and pans lay in disarray, a chair overturned near the counter. Ethan stood motionless, absorbing the scene. This wasn't just destruction, it was deliberate. A calculated mess, meant to send a message. Shaking his head, he pulled out his phone and opened the security app for the house. The live feed showed nothing out of place now, but when he scrolled through the recorded footage, the real story unfolded. Lisa had stormed into the house hours earlier, her movements erratic, her fury unmistakable. She moved through each room like a hurricane, toppling furniture, throwing anything within reach. Her mouth moved, yelling at no one in particular, the sound lost in the silent recording. It didn't matter what she was saying, the rage was clear. Ethan exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath as he tapped the save button. She really thought she could get away with this. No hesitation. He dialed the police. When the dispatcher answered, his voice was calm but firm. "I'd like to report a violation of a restraining order. I have security footage of the incident. And I'd like to file charges." As he ended the call, a wave of exhaustion settled over him. But beneath it, a deeper sense of resolve took hold. Lisa had crossed the line, and this time, there would be consequences. When the officers arrived, Ethan handed them the footage without a word, letting the images speak for themselves. One officer reviewed the screen and nodded grimly. "We'll take it from here, sir. She won't be bothering you again anytime soon." Ethan watched them leave, a faint sense of closure settling over him. Lisa's meltdown was just another chapter in the saga, but this time, the law was on his side. A week after Lisa's arrest, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, finishing his morning coffee, when his phone buzzed. Marcus. The message was short. Can we talk? Against his better judgment, Ethan agreed. Curiosity outweighed resentment. Maybe it was time to finally get some closure. Later that afternoon, the two men sat across from each other in a quiet diner. The tension between them was thick, though neither seemed eager to escalate it. Marcus looked uncomfortable, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a napkin. Ethan, on the other hand, leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed, exuding an air of calm indifference. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. His voice was low, but sincere. I owe you an apology. For everything. He hesitated, then added, I didn't know she was married, Ethan. If I had, I swear, I would have walked away the moment I found out. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. And yet, here we are. Marcus nodded, shame flickering across his face. I believed her lies. She told me you were abusive. Controlling. That you didn't care about her. He let out a quiet sigh. She made herself out to be the victim. And I fell for it. Ethan studied him for a long moment before responding. At least you're honest about it now, he said. That's more than she's ever been. The conversation stalled, the silence between them waited but not entirely hostile. Then, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. Ethan eyed it warily. What's this? Marcus folded his hands together. It's yours, he said simply. Your lottery ticket. Ethan frowned. Lottery ticket? Marcus nodded. Lisa gave it to me a while back. Said it was a gift, something she didn't want you to know about. I didn't think much of it until recently, but when I checked. He exhaled. Ethan, it's a winner. A big one. For the first time, Ethan's composure cracked. You're serious? Dead serious. Ethan stared at the envelope, his mind racing. He didn't even remember buying a lottery ticket, let alone giving one to Lisa. And now, suddenly, it was back in his hands, with life-altering implications. He looked up at Marcus, his voice quieter now. Why? Marcus sighed. Because, Ethan studied Marcus, searching for the motive behind his unexpected honesty. Why give it back? He asked, his voice quieter now. Marcus let out a slow sigh. Because I was a part of Lisa's mess, and I don't want to be anymore, he admitted. I've made enough mistakes, but keeping that ticket? That would have been the worst one. He hesitated, as if considering saying more, but instead, he simply raised an eyebrow and left it at that. Ethan leaned back in his seat, a swirl of emotions hitting him all at once, vindication, shock, and an odd sense of gratitude. He extended a hand toward Marcus, who paused for a second before shaking it. Thanks, Ethan said, his voice measured. For doing the right thing. Marcus gave a tight nod, then stood, slipping his jacket over his shoulders. As he left the diner, Ethan stared down at the ticket in his hand. A small piece of paper, but one that carried so much weight. For once, it felt like life was tipping the scales in his favor. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation as Ethan sat beside Jason at the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Lisa fidgeted anxiously, her attorney whispering urgently in her ear. Then, the judge entered, a stern man with sharp features, and the session was called to order. Jason stood first, his confidence steady as he addressed the court. Your Honor, we have undeniable evidence of infidelity, financial misconduct, and destruction of property by the defendant. My client has acted in good faith throughout this ordeal, but it is evident that the defendant has not. He moved seamlessly through his argument, presenting piece after piece of evidence, photographs from the private investigator, bank statements showing Lisa's unauthorized spending, and, most damning of all, the security footage of her rampage through the house. With each item, the picture became clearer. There was no room left for doubt. Lisa's lawyer attempted to steer the narrative, leaning into emotional appeals. "Your Honor, my client has been under immense emotional stress. While her actions were regrettable, they were driven by overwhelming turmoil. She is deeply remorseful and seeks a fair resolution." Lisa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her tears carefully measured, but the judge didn't so much as flinch. His expression hardened as he turned his attention to her. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice firm, "remorse does not absolve accountability. The evidence presented is irrefutable. Actions have consequences, and it is clear you have acted with reckless disregard for both your husband and the property you shared." Lisa's face drained of color, her sobs quieting as the weight of his words settled over her. When Jason stood to deliver his closing argument, his tone was calm but resolute. "Your Honor, my client is not seeking revenge, he is seeking fairness. After years of deception and betrayal, he deserves to leave this marriage with what is rightfully his, free from any undue financial burden." The judge nodded, his decision swift. "I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Mr. Carter will retain ownership of the marital home and his personal assets. The defendant is not entitled to alimony, given her actions. Furthermore, the restraining order will remain in effect. This court stands adjourned." The gavel struck, and Ethan exhaled deeply, the tension leaving his body in a single breath. Jason turned to him with a small, satisfied smile. The judge didn't buy her sob story. Justice at last. Ethan glanced across the room where Lisa sat frozen, disbelief etched across her face. But he felt no triumph. No satisfaction. Only relief. This wasn't about winning, it was about finally reclaiming his life. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the sun hit his face, warm and steady. And for the first time in a long time, the weight of the past was no longer his to carry. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was the beginning of something new. The weeks following the court's decision were unforgiving to Lisa. Stripped of any alimony and forced to vacate the home she once ruled over, she was left scrambling for stability. The life she had so confidently built had crumbled beneath her feet. At first, she clung to the illusion of independence. She found a small apartment in the city, stretching what little savings she had left to cover the rent. But without Ethan's income to rely on, the reality of her situation hit fast and hard. The bills stacked up, credit card debt, overdue rent, and the costs of maintaining the lifestyle she had once taken for granted. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Lisa was forced to accept the truth: she couldn't do it on her own. Under the cover of night, she packed her belongings and moved back into her parents' modest suburban home, slipping in quietly to avoid the judgmental stares of neighbors who had once envied her seemingly perfect life. Her childhood bedroom, once a space of innocence and hope, now felt suffocating. The woman who once saw herself as a queen was now just a guest in her own past, surrounded by faded wallpaper and outdated furniture that mocked what she had lost. The weight of her downfall hit hardest at the dinner table. Her parents, well-meaning but hesitant, tiptoed around conversations about her future. They asked polite questions about her plans, their words careful, their gazes wary. Lisa, who had always thrived on attention and admiration, now found herself shrinking under their pity. "I'll figure it out," she muttered one evening, absently pushing around a forkful of reheated casserole. But even she didn't believe it. Meanwhile, her attempts to rebuild what she had lost were met with silence. Marcus, who had already distanced himself the moment her lies were exposed, refused to answer her calls. Former friends, those who once surrounded her, entertained by her stories and drawn to her charm, had moved on. Lisa was left with nothing but the echoes of a life she could no longer claim. For the first time in years, she was forced to sit with herself. No distractions. No illusions. Just the reflection in the mirror, showing a woman she barely recognized, humbled, lost, unsure of where to go next. While Lisa unraveled, Ethan found solace in Emily's steady presence. She never pushed. Never asked for more than he was ready to give. She was just there, with a home-cooked meal when he hadn't eaten, a simple text to check in, a quiet moment shared on the porch when words weren't needed. One evening, as the sky melted into shades of orange and pink, Ethan found himself opening up in a way he hadn't in years. "It's strange," he admitted, his voice calm but edged with something deeper. "For so long, I felt like I was just going through the motions. Like I was invisible." Emily leaned forward, resting a gentle hand over his. "You're not invisible, Ethan. You never were," she said softly. "You just didn't have someone who saw you the way you deserved." Her words settled into him, deeper than he expected. For the first time in years, he felt like someone genuinely cared, not out of obligation, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. As the evening stretched on, Ethan could no longer ignore the sincerity in her presence. It wasn't performative. It wasn't conditional. It was real, unwavering, healing. And in that, he began to see something more than just a friend. Not a replacement. Not a distraction. But the beginning of something new. A chapter that felt promising, not daunting. 6 months later, Ethan sat in the quiet conference room of Jason's law office. The final divorce papers lay spread out before him. The air was still, almost heavy. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt light. This moment, one he had dreaded for so long, now felt like the final step toward freedom. Across the table, Lisa sat with her lawyer, her once fiery defiance nowhere to be seen. She barely looked at him, her gaze locked onto the document before her. The terms were clear. Ethan would keep the house and the bulk of his assets, while Lisa would walk away with only the bare minimum, just enough financial support to cover basic necessities for a limited time. Her initial demands for spousal support had been denied outright, thanks to the undeniable proof of her actions. "Is everything in order?" Jason's voice cut through the silence. Ethan gave a short nod. "It's exactly what we agreed on." He reached for the pen, signing his name with steady hands. Each stroke of ink felt like shedding another weight he had carried for too long. Lisa followed suit, though her movements were slower, her reluctance evident. When she finally set the pen down, it was as if the room itself let out a breath. "It's done," Jason said, sliding the papers into a folder. "You're officially free." For the first time, Lisa lifted her gaze to meet Ethan's. Her expression was unreadable. "I guess this is goodbye," she said quietly. Ethan held her stare, unwavering. "Goodbye, Lisa. Take care of yourself." With that, he stood, nodding once to Jason before walking out of the room. The sun was bright as he stepped outside, its warmth a sharp contrast to the coldness of the past few months. For the first time in years, he felt untethered. No longer weighed down by a crumbling marriage or the manipulation that had kept him trapped. As he drove away, he allowed himself a small smile. The chapter was finally closed. He had signed the papers and walked away for good, leaving the past where it belonged. And ahead of him lay something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Possibility. Months after the divorce was finalized, an unmarked envelope appeared in Ethan's mailbox. At first, he thought nothing of it, tossing it onto the kitchen counter with the rest of the day's mail. But later that evening, as he sifted through the pile, something about the handwriting caught his attention. Lisa's. He stared at the envelope for a long moment before tearing it open. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, was a handwritten letter. The words were shaky but deliberate. "Ethan. I don't know where to start, so I'll just say it, I'm sorry. For everything. For the lies, the betrayal, the destruction. I never meant to hurt you the way I did. But I see now that my intentions don't matter. My actions do. And they hurt you deeply. You didn't deserve that. Lisa's words spilled across the page, filled with regret. She acknowledged the pain she had caused, the choices she had made, and the life she had ruined. You were a good man, Ethan. Better than I deserved. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I see it clearly now. I hope you find happiness. You deserve it. Ethan set the letter down, his emotion steady but distant. It was too late for apologies. The scars Lisa had left were reminders of what he had endured, and what he had overcome. He wasn't angry anymore. But he wasn't moved to respond, either. Some bridges are better left burned, he muttered, neatly folding the letter and slipping it back into the envelope. Rather than dwell on the past, Ethan chose to focus on the present. On the life he was building. On the peace he had finally found. Lisa's apology was hers to carry. Not his to absolve. He placed the envelope in a drawer, not out of sentimentality, but as a quiet marker of a past he had finally left behind. As the months passed, Ethan and Emily's bond grew stronger, built on trust, understanding, and moments that felt effortless. Unlike the chaos of Ethan's past relationships, being with Emily was easy in the best way possible. She didn't just see him, she valued him, scars and all. One crisp autumn afternoon, they were in the garden behind Ethan's house, planting bulbs that Emily promised would bloom beautifully come spring. She knelt in the dirt, her hair falling loosely around her face, laughing as Ethan struggled with the shovel. "You're better at spreadsheets than spades," she teased, grinning up at him. "Hey," Ethan shot back, pretending to be offended as he wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "I'm learning. You're the expert gardener here." Their banter was light, their laughter easy. It was in these small, ordinary moments that Ethan realized how much Emily had become a part of his life. Where there had once been chaos, there was now peace. And hope. A few weeks later, Emily invited Ethan to her favorite cafe. She seemed nervous, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her mug, but there was excitement in her eyes. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice steady, though her smile hinted at something more. Ethan leaned forward, his brow furrowing slightly. "You're starting to scare me. What's going on?" Emily reached into her bag, pulling out a small rectangular piece of paper. She slid it across the table, her smile widening as Ethan picked it up. It was a sonogram. Ethan blinked, his brain scrambling to process what he was looking at. Then, Emily spoke the words that changed everything. "We're having twins." Her voice trembled slightly with emotion, but her happiness was undeniable. Ethan stared at the image, then back at Emily, completely speechless. For a moment, his mind struggled to catch up. Then, slowly, a grin broke across his face, his eyes lighting up with a mix of shock, joy, and something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Twins," he finally said, shaking his head in mock exasperation. "I hope you're ready for double the trouble." Emily laughed, her eyes glistening as she reached for his hand. "You'll be amazing, Ethan. I know it." Ethan squeezed her hand, his heart fuller than it had been in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. With Emily by his side, with the promise of a family ahead, life felt open again. Full of possibility. As they stepped out of the cafe, the world seemed brighter, the weight of the past no longer a shadow. They were stepping into a new chapter, one filled with challenges, yes, but also love, laughter, and the kind of happiness Ethan had once thought was lost to him forever. One quiet afternoon, there was an unexpected knock at Ethan's door. Opening it, he found Marcus standing on the porch, a worn envelope clutched in his hand. The awkwardness between them was thick, but Marcus's expression was resolute. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," Marcus started, his voice steady, sincere. "But there's something I need to do before I can move on." Ethan crossed his arms, his expression wary but open. "What is it, Marcus?" Marcus extended the envelope toward him. "Your share of the lottery winnings," he said simply. "I couldn't keep it, knowing everything you've been through because of all this." Ethan stared at the envelope, then back at Marcus. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. "Why now?" Marcus exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Because it's the right thing to do," he admitted. "Lisa dragged both of us into her mess, and I've already taken enough from you without even realizing it." His gaze was steady. "This isn't about guilt. It's about closure." Ethan hesitated for a moment before finally taking the envelope from Marcus. Inside was a check with his name on it, an amount that would make anyone stop and take a second look. He lifted his eyes to Marcus, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do this," Ethan said finally, his voice even. "I know," Marcus replied, managing a small, tired smile. "But I wanted to. Maybe it's selfish, but I needed to set things right, at least in some small way." For the first time, Ethan saw a glimpse of the man Marcus might have been without Lisa's influence. Someone with integrity, someone capable of doing the right thing when it truly mattered. Ethan nodded, then extended his hand. "Thanks." Marcus took it, his grip firm but brief. "Take care of yourself, Ethan. I hope this helps you move forward." And with that, he turned and walked away. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the envelope still in his hand, watching as Marcus disappeared down the street. The money mattered, sure. But what really struck him was the acknowledgement, the unspoken admission that Marcus understood the damage Lisa had caused. This wasn't about guilt. It was about closure. Stepping back inside, Ethan set the envelope on the counter and let out a slow breath. For the first time in a long time, the past wasn't holding him back. The future was his. One quiet evening, Ethan sat on the porch, watching the golden hues of the sunset stretch across the sky. The air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of fallen leaves, a signal of the seasons shifting. But for once, change didn't feel like something to fear. It felt steady. Grounding. He let his mind drift over everything he had endured, the lies, the heartbreak, the battles he never asked to fight. There had been moments when it felt like too much, like he was drowning in betrayal, in loss, in the weight of starting over. But every time, he had found a way to rise. To keep moving, even when it felt impossible. Resilience, he realized, wasn't about pretending everything was okay. It was about facing the pain head-on, refusing to let it define him, and finding a way to heal, no matter how long it took. Growth didn't come from avoiding hardship. It came from pushing through it, learning from it, and emerging on the other side stronger than before. His gaze shifted to the garden, where Emily knelt, tending to the plants they had nurtured together. Her laughter carried through the air, soft and warm, wrapping around him like a quiet reminder of how far he had come. She had been his anchor through the storm, a living, breathing reminder that even after the darkest moments, there was still light. Still hope. The future stretched wide before him now, filled with possibilities he had once been too afraid to imagine. With Emily by his side and the promise of a family on the horizon, Ethan finally understood something that had eluded him for so long. Life's detours didn't always lead to dead ends. Sometimes, they led to something better. Leaning back in his chair, he let out a contented sigh, the quiet truth settling deep in his bones. Life doesn't always go as planned, he murmured to himself. Then, with a small smile, he added. But sometimes, it works out better than you ever imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan let himself savor the moment, letting the warmth of the present settle over him like a well-earned peace. The past had shaped him. That was undeniable. But it no longer held him captive. The road ahead was his. And for the first time in a long, long time, he was looking forward to every step.